Hi, so today is June 16th, 2020, and I'm interviewing my friend Kay Bauman. Hey, Kay.
Hi,
Hey, so let's start off by you telling me about your childhood. Where did you grow up? What were your parents like? What kind of stories do you remember from your childhood?
I grew up in Michigan. I was actually born in Flint, but I was moved to Midland, Michigan, the home of Dow Chemical Company, when I was like two and a half. And spent all of my childhood and high school years there. And my parents lived there for decades until they retired to Florida. So that's where I graduated from high school, Midland High School. My dad was a school teacher. My mom only graduated from high school, so I didn't really come from an educated family. Um, but my dad had a college education because of a football scholarship. He actually had been a pro football player in the 20s and was my high school football coach. So even though I was a bit of a nerd, I was an okay person because when your dad's the football coach, you're okay.
So, which team did he play for?
He played for Milwaukee when they had a team and then was sold to Green Bay to the Packers. And but after a very short time there, he quit because he said he couldn't drink enough to be a pro football player. And in this day and age, maybe you would say you couldn't drug enough. And you also had to have a regular job because the pay was very, very like $50 a game in the 20s. So um, he ended up saying that this was not for him.
And what position did he play?
He was a guard. He always said a guard was the quarterback with his brains knocked out.
Was he
Funny that I even know what position he played, huh?
was he a big guy?
Well, in his day, yes. And nowadays, he wouldn't be. He was 6 feet and about 220 pounds, so square built, not a bit of obesity or anything, Polish by ancestry. So very, very much a lineman.
And what about your mom?
Played college football. So my brothers were in high school when I was born, and one graduated from West Point, so played for Army, and he was an end. The other one did some running around in colleges and played a while for U of M.
Uh-huh. And what about your mom? What did she do?
My mom was a stay-at-home mom. My dad had a small business that he and another teacher eventually set up selling crossbars that are used for high jump and pole vault and track. My dad was also a track coach. And so mom did that business at home, but she never worked outside of home.
And what do you remember from your childhood? I mean, did you grow up? Yeah, what was your house like? And
Well, now when I look back, it was very, very lower middle class because teachers didn't make much in those days. And I've gone back to my hometown and seen my neighborhood, and my kids would just be astonished. But I didn't really look at it that way. I just was an okay person and didn't think much about it. But but the values that I have as an adult and as a human being were certainly brought to me by my parents. Um, Even in a lily white community, because Dow Chemical Company, which is what Midland is home to, didn't hire Jews, didn't hire Blacks, didn't hire Mexican Americans or other Hispanics. And so it was a very white conservative city, but my parents weren't. My parents were very liberal. Well, when you're a coach, you include all people. And of course, in Flint had a large Black community. So my dad and mom had lived there for a number of years. So I was taught right from the beginning that Black people were fine and that other people were fine. And um, my home church also was liberal church in Midland. And we did youth trips to Detroit and to Chicago to the Black communities and stayed with I'm Methodist, Black Methodist churches, even in the days when those churches were in a separate conference. But that really helped to make me understand and celebrate the world and diversity. And especially when I see what's been happening in the last month here.
What else do you remember? I mean, from your childhood, did you play with your brothers a lot? Did you have a lot of friends in the neighborhood?
I didn't ever know my brothers because they they graduated from high school before my memory. I mean, one graduated when I was 2 and one graduated, I think, when I was 3.5 or something. They were just a year apart. So I don't have any memories of living with my brothers. Um, I did in my generation, even though I was raised by a football coach and a track coach, and was very much an outdoors person and an athlete in a way. I mean, if people wanted to throw the football in the neighborhood, they knocked on my door. They didn't go to the other guys in the neighborhood because they knew I could throw a spiral like anybody. Um, but they didn't really have women's sports. We just had intramural sports. So I did that, but we didn't in those days have women's sports.
Which sports did you do?
Well, in intramural, we played volleyball. I actually was on the tumbling and trampoline team, and we did sometimes perform a halftime show at basketball games and stuff like that. But that's really about it.
Okay, and what do you remember about high school?
I liked high school. I had a lot of good friends. Like I say, I was a nerd and did very well in school. Was the salutatorian of my high school class, so second highest. My parents, just somebody's at my door, but I'm on an interview. I can't talk.
Isn't it key to the neighbor's house for the pool? Aren't you the one I talked to last week?
Yes. Please bring it back.
I'll bring it right back.
Okay, thank you. All right.
Thanks.
Okay, so yeah, I'm in charge of the neighbor, my across the street neighbor sold her house and she's left me sort of in charge of the pool with a key, and the back gate was locked, so he needed a key. So sorry for the interruption.
So you're in high school. You're talking about high school.
So yeah, I had a lot of good friends, and I was also did music, was in the choir and accompanied the choir. So I both sang in the choir and accompanied the choir, and did that through junior high and high school and in my church choir and all of that. So music was a part of my life as well.
When did you decide to become a doctor? Was that in high school?
Well, that's a very good question because I love answering this one. It never occurred to me in high school because, again, in my generation, women weren't doctors. And though I was good at science and good at math and had people skills, it never occurred to me. But my parents let me choose only a state college because they couldn't afford a private college. So I ended up applying to and being accepted at University of Michigan in the Honors College. So I went down for orientation, and the interviewer or my counselor for my orientation was an emeritus English professor, interestingly, so not a scientist. But he asked me, "What do you want to do?" And I said, "I don't know. I have no idea what I want to do." And he said, "Well, have you ever considered medicine?" I said, "I don't want to be a nurse." He said, "A nurse? I don't mean a nurse. I mean a doctor." I said, "Me? A doctor?" I had never considered it, ever, ever, ever. And so from that day on, I was pre-med.
And then which college did you attend?
I attended Michigan for both my undergrad degree. I have a master's in microbiology from there, and my MD are all from University of Michigan. And one other sort of funny addendum to this is that when I graduated from medical school, my dad and mom, of course, were there. And my dad said afterwards, "I always wanted one of my sons to be a doctor." And he was not insulting me. It was a true compliment. But in other words, in his mind, he had never considered that his daughter could be a doctor.
So were you the only female that graduated in your class to become a
No,
doctor?
our class had 200 and some, I think, students in it, and we were about 10% women. So there were, maybe 20 in my class, but
And then-
not very many.
okay.
Many rotations and so forth. I was the only woman, but yeah.
And when did you meet your husband?
My husband's from my same hometown, so I knew his whole family before I met him. Um, his brother was one of my closest friends in high school. We sang in the choir octet together and just hung out and were very good friends. We had kept an exchange student from Germany when I was a senior in high school, and my eventual brother-in-law dated her. So that was another way we were friends. Um, and then I'm a bridge player and was raised to be a bridge player. And my husband's whole family were bridge players, his parents and siblings. And so Jim and I actually met the summer after I graduated from high school playing bridge with some mutual friends.
And then did you get married while you were in med school or college?
I got married right before I started med school, but Jim had already completed 2 years of med school. So he was about to start his third year and I was about to start med school. So I was young. I was just 20.
You were 20. Wow.
Yeah.
And I think was it during that time or right after that time that you had someone came and lived with you and you took care of them?
Yes, I didn't remember that you knew this. I mean, there are some things you don't know about me, but you know a lot about me, Mike. And yes, our very first year of marriage, we had read, I think on the church bulletin board or someplace, maybe on a campus, that a quadriplegic woman had a scholarship to get a master's in math from Michigan, and she was from Buffalo, New York, and needed a place to stay. Well, she obviously, as a quadriplegic, needed total care as well. But her scholarship paid for the rent and some money toward food. So Jim and I said, we can do that. And his mom had multiple sclerosis. So he had lived, I mean, she was still alive then, but was in a wheelchair and had been in a wheelchair for years. So he was used to somebody living with somebody, and that was easier for him than it might have been for someone else. So yes, Penny lived with us for that year, and it was I've counted recently how many people have lived with me and my family for, like, let's say 3 months or more, or 2 or 3 months or more, and it's over 20 over the years, but Penny was the first one as a quadriplegic, and it was her first ever experience of living away from home. She had become a quadriplegic at age 8, and in those days, we didn't even have computers. So her mom went to all her college classes with her, took the notes, sat and did her exams for her, but she was brilliant. And after she got her degree and then got her master's from Michigan, got a job with Kodak, which was home base there in Buffalo.
So you've had a lot of people live with you throughout the years. I mean, why did your parents have a lot of people living with you, your family? Or?
When I was a senior in high school, we had an exchange student from Germany, and we stayed very close friends with that family, particularly with that mother. It was a direct exchange. Well, in other words, I went to Germany for the summer before my senior year in high school and lived with that. There was no father. He had been killed in the war, but with the mother, the grandmother, and Hartmute, the daughter, for the summer. And then Hartmute came to my house and lived with our family for the whole year. But Grandma Trepper, or my mom, stayed very close to my family and was another grandma to all my kids, was at all their weddings as long as she was alive. She was in the delivery room when my daughter Jessica was born. She was went camping with us, went on hikes with us. I mean, backpack trips. She really was very much a part of our family. So that was cool.
And so how many children have you had?
I have 4 daughters.
And how many grandchildren do you have?
Well, I have 10 grandchildren. So the oldest and the youngest each have 2, and the second and the third each have 3. So the grandchildren vary in age. My children were born over a wide span of years because the first one was born in New Orleans. We spent a year in New Orleans where I got a master's in public health, and my husband did his internship at Charity Hospital. So my first baby was born at Charity Hospital in New Orleans, and she was the only white baby in the nursery. And there were about 80 babies in the nursery because it was a gigantic hospital. So I know I got the right one. My second baby was born in Alaska because Jim, my husband, was doing a 2-year requirement during the Vietnam days with the Indian Health Service, and he chose not to go to Vietnam, but all doctors had to serve, so he joined the Public Health Service, and we spent those years in Alaska. So Julie was born in Alaska, in Bethel, Alaska, way out in the tundra. And then we spent some years when I did the medical school and internship and all of that with just the 2 kids. And then my third daughter was born in Phoenix, and my last one was born here in Tucson.
And then, so you both were doctors, you had kids, really wonderful times. But then your husband ended up committing suicide. And why did that happen?
I was hoping that you remembered that, but I didn't know what details of my life you knew, Mike. Yes, Jim, 35 years ago, so a long time ago now, died by suicide. He wasn't chronically depressed. It was an acute depression related to a malpractice suit. It was a wrongful death, but it really wasn't his fault. It was a laboratory error. And the laboratory didn't notify the doctor, and it was the internal medicine doctor who was under that pay. He had delivered the lady's baby and then turned her care over to an internist at his clinic after the postpartum checkup. And she died of a complication of a medicine that Jim had originally prescribed, but that the internist was now in charge of. And he had done a lab test, and she had a very abnormal level of potassium, which caused her cardiac problem, and she died of a heart attack from an electrolyte problem. And Jim felt guilty, severely guilty about it, because he had been the one that started her on that medicine for her blood pressure. She'd had hypertension all throughout her pregnancy, and he managed it perfectly well, and she had a healthy baby, and they were doing fine at the postpartum checkup. But then she ended up under the care of the internist, and the internist ordered the lab test appropriately, but the lab never called with this grossly abnormal test, and it was a wrongful death. She should never have died, but they ended up suing Jim and the internist and the lab and the this and the that and everything, and he felt so guilty about it that he thought he'd lose his license and could never practice medicine again, so he killed himself.
So how did you all deal with that? I mean,
Oh, that was an incredible challenge to us. The youngest, Jessica, was only 4 when he died. So the kids were 4, 9, 16, and 18. So the 18-year-old, my oldest, had already started college, but was just a freshman. The second daughter was a senior in high school. And then Jennifer was only 9, and Jess hadn't even started kindergarten yet. So it was very different for each aged child to experience the wrongful death of their father. I mean, a horrible death of their father. And so, yeah, I was a single mom for most of Jessica's life and much of Jennifer's, whereas the older 2 really had a wonderful dad for all their childhood and most of their childhood years and teenage years. So they really have wonderful memories of their daddy. He was a good daddy. And Jennifer has some memories. Jessica really has no memories, hardly at all, of her dad.
Where were you living then?
I have to stop and think. Here in Tucson.
Okay, so you're in Tucson. Okay, you were working full-time.
Both of us were. Yeah, he was a doctor in private practice, and I was at the faculty at the medical school.
So you continued working, of course, and then did your 16-year-old daughter really help out in the house and prepare meals and all that, or do you remember?
Oh, I mean, she was soon to graduate. I mean, he died in February and she graduated in May or June, whenever it was back then, and then went on to college. So it was just me eventually with the two younger ones. And, I was always thankful to be a doctor because I could afford to raise my kids as a single parent. Whereas if I had been a nurse or a social worker or something else, it would have been very difficult to put the kids, all four kids, through college. Two of them are doctors and one was a lawyer. So they've all, three of the four, been to professional school as well. And I was able to provide them that college education. And I was so thankful that I was a doc and had a halfway decent income. I'm a family doc, so it wasn't a high income for a doc. It's one of the lowest paid, but nonetheless, it was a decent income compared to most other professions.
Now, you've spent a good deal of time in Hawaii too, right?
Yes, I was faculty here at the med school. I first started my career in migrant health care, and that was up in the Phoenix area, and did 4 years in a migrant health clinic there, and then a year in South Texas in migrant health care, as Jim did as well. And then we didn't fit in South Texas, so we came back here to Tucson and worked in a neighborhood health center, El Rio, for a while. And then eventually I was recruited to the university, and Jim was in a private practice group. And then after a number of years in Tucson, 79 to 92, so 13 years in Tucson, I was recruited to the University of Hawaii Medical School. That school still did not even have a family medicine residency or a family medicine third-year rotation, a required rotation that the vast majority of medical schools had by then. So they set up a department, hired a chair from Hawaii locally, but hired faculty from the mainland. And my main job was to set up that required third-year rotation. And another woman was hired, and her job was mainly to start the residency. And after 2 years, on July 1, we had both the required clerkship and the residency started. And of course, they're going on and have always been. So I loved being faculty. Come in. I loved being faculty in Hawaii. It was well, I guess my life has been spent celebrating diversity, and Hawaii is such a diverse population that there's no majority in Hawaii. So you can never assume how a patient is going to deal with illness, whether it's diabetes or cancer or whatever, whether they're Japanese, Filipino, Hawaiian, Samoan, Tongan, Chinese, or white.
So you talk about diversity. You've spent a good deal of time harvesting fruit and working with refugees through Iskashita Refugee Network as a volunteer. Can you talk about that a bit?
I can, but let me tell you a little bit more about, we mentioned before Penny, the quadriplegic who lived with us, but I've done some, thinking back about how I raised my kids to also celebrate diversity. And one of the ways is I've always opened my home to people living with me. And I think you know that, Michael, but, and I was making a list, and for people who've lived with me for 3 months or more, they've come from all over the place. And yes, the first one was Penny, the quadriplegic, but the next one was from Africa, from Madagascar, and he was an exchange student who lived with us in Ann Arbor. We had an exchange student from Portugal living with us. We've had Canadian people here in Tucson who were working with a woofer program, which was an organic farming program. I've had a Mexican man living with me for several months here in Tucson. Here in Tucson, I've had 2 asylum seekers living with me, one for 3 or 4 months from Burundi, and one for a year and a half from Rwanda. And it was Iskashita that you mentioned that hooked me up with them. And tonight, I'm going to have somebody moving in, an asylum seeker from Uganda. So I haven't even met him yet. His name is Pastor Richard, and he arrives on the plane tonight. In Hawaii, my daughter Jessica had a friend from school who was from a neighbor island, but who was going to her school. And her mom had thought she'd set up a home for her, but it didn't work out. So Alana, last name Gu, G-O-O, so Chinese, lived with us for over 3 years as going to Jessica's high school. I had others in Hawaii living with me, a nephew for a while, a Hawaiian man lived with me for a couple of years, other whites and so forth. So the numbers added up to well over 20 who had lived with me for anywhere from 3 months to 3 years. Now, Iskashita is also a program that I'm involved with here in Tucson. And yeah, one of the people who lived with me here in Tucson was actually Stephanie, who worked for Iskashita as a volunteer, sponsored by the Methodist Church for a year. And she did 2 years of volunteer work for Iskashita and lived with another woman from my church her first year, and then her second year she lived with me. So it was that Stephanie was going to live with me and did live with me that I got totally involved. So I've been involved with Iskashita over 6 years now. And we used to have all of the Iskashita parties at my house, so it was called the Iskashita Nightclub, which I think is funny. And it was just interesting that one of the parties we had, they were singing, and the refugees came from all these different countries, many African countries. And I just couldn't believe that they were singing in Burundian in my back room, in my music room with my piano. One of the guys was a musician, a professional musician, actually, he still is. But it was just amazing to me to hear in my own house all of these different languages being sung in. It was just wonderful. But yeah, I harvest fruit throughout the year, twice a week. But right now, they've had to shut down the group harvest because of the COVID-19. But my daughter, who had to close her business, and I have been harvesting almost every single weekday for, probably 10 weeks now.
You mentioned your church.
Yes.
And so how important and what is your involvement, with your church? And I know you do another refugee project too in the Rochester area, I believe,
No, in Albany, New York. Well, I'm going to go back another topic. We talked about celebrating diversity and all the cultural diversity, and in practicing in Hawaii, how diverse that community is. But as a doctor, my first area of expertise that got me a local, statewide, and a national reputation was that I was an AIDS doctor at the very beginning of the epidemic. So that's also a part of the cultural diversity that I celebrate, is to the gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender community. Back in the early 80s, when AIDS was just becoming a huge problem in our country, and we still don't have an AIDS vaccine, and they're working so hard to get a COVID vaccine, but we don't have a vaccine against malaria, tuberculosis, and AIDS, which are 3 of the biggest world killers, But anyway, I became an AIDS doc, and the reason I became an AIDS doc is a bit interesting, is that I was in private practice just for a couple of years before I came over to the university here. And I had looked at the gay lesbian population as an underserved population. And I had many gay lesbian friends and colleagues, and it was part of my community. And I realized that these patients couldn't be themselves with their docs. The docs always presumed heterosexuality. And so they didn't identify their gay men patients as at risk for AIDS. And in fact, they're lesbian patients who weren't at risk for AIDS, but often they would say to a woman, a young woman, are you sexually active? And they might answer, well, yes. Well, you're on birth control. Well, I don't need it. Why? I mean, have you had your tubes tied, or has your partner had a vasectomy, or are you on birth control? You know, just that kind of questioning that doctors presumed heterosexuality and didn't know how to take inclusive history. So I actually created and taught the very first course in a medical school in our country here at U of A on caring for gay and lesbian patients, and teaching medical students to ask questions such as, who lives at home? Rather than, are you married? You know, because back in the 80s, you couldn't be married. Now you can be married, so if you're gay or lesbian. But anyway, so, and I was on a number of national AIDS committees and wrote a lot of the very first national guidelines on a committee that did that. So that was a major part of my academic life here, but also in Hawaii. When I went to Hawaii, I was also doing AIDS education throughout the Pacific Basin. So I've done AIDS education on Guam, where we brought in doctors and practitioners and nurses from all of these Pacific islands that surround Guam, and did a week-long educational program on AIDS, which was just exciting. And I've been in the Marshall Islands and done education there. So it's just been amazing where you go when you live in Hawaii. So I did want to add that in as to a part of the diversity that I celebrate is not just cultural, but also gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender. And I remain active with that. My church here in Tucson, St. Francis in the Foothills Methodist Church, is what they call a reconciling community. And that means welcoming gay, lesbian, bisexual, whatever population. And it's been one for over 30 years. And that's unusual. That's very unusual. Another church, Catalina Methodist here in Tucson, just became a reconciling congregation within the last year. So, and St. Francis has been one for over 30 years. But I was a leader in getting that process started. And the minister, who was a minister there for over 30 years, though he's retired now, David Wilkinson, gives me credit for moving him along the path. He said he was homophobic when he started. I never knew him to be homophobic, but from homophobia to tolerance to advocacy. And he's very, very much an advocate for that community, as I am now. And so that's just been a wonderful story. I have so many stories. Can I tell a story? Okay, then I'll tell a couple of stories, but one of them is an interesting one. I had a patient come to me that was brand new to me, but he had AIDS, late stage AIDS disease, in the time when we had very few medicines. But I knew who he was because he was on our prayer list at St. Francis, and we prayed for him. So I knew him by name, but I had never seen him. I wasn't his doctor. But he came to me one day asking me to write him a prescription for a medicine to kill himself because he was real tired of fighting this end stage of AIDS and just tired of life. And I happened to have a poster on my exam room wall that said, it was a Jonathan Livingston Seagull poster that said, here's a test to see if your life on earth is over. If you're living, it's not. And so I looked at that and I looked at him, and for a brand new patient, even though I sort of believe in being able to do that as doctors, I couldn't give a prescription to a man I'd never even seen before as his doctor to kill himself. So we sat and talked for a minute, and I said, but I know what your purpose is, and I think you do too. And it's moving our minister along this path of understanding what gayness is and becoming an advocate. And he looked at me with a big smile and he said, you're right. That is my job. I will continue to do it. Thank you, Doc. So that's one of my favorite stories. And I actually, when I came back to Tucson and went back to St. Francis after being gone over 20 years, when I joined, David was still the pastor. And I told this story in the membership class that I was rejoining again. And he knew the patient by name. He said, thank you. And he said the name to the others in the class that he remembered that story. I just thought that was amazing. It was amazing.
And so what are you doing in Albany?
Well, I actually met a friend, a very close friend of mine now, at St. Francis here in Tucson, who's from Albany, born and raised and educated there, and had a dream in the neighborhood in which he was raised. His parents were raised, his grandparents were raised, great-grandparents. He still had a house on a single block, it's called Elk Street, that had gone downhill and become one of the highest crime rate neighborhoods in the city. And people were vacating it. And his dream, well, he and I worked together here in Tucson on the asylum seekers, and we had somebody at St. Francis living, Francisco, that we both really supported him to prevent his deportation. And Tim, before he worked at St. Francis, his name is Tim Doherty, had worked on some of the border projects here in Arizona to bring water, for example, to the border crossers to try and save deaths. There's multiple border projects. So he had been very active with that before he came to St. Francis. So he taught me a lot about that. And the sanctuary movement that Francisco was in, we both were active in. But then he started telling me about his dream for his local neighborhood in Albany. And that was to pick up some of these old houses, and I'm talking 150 or more years old, because it was a very old, it used to be stable, lower middle class, working class neighborhood when his grandparents and great-grandparents lived there. But like I said, it had now become drug using, crime, illegal business, prostitution. And his dream had been to be able to buy some of these properties, renovate them, and rent them to refugees. Well, I got excited about that project and agreed to become a financial supporter of it. And now my first trip was, this May was 5 years ago, and Tim had gone back 5 years ago in May from St. Francis back to Albany. And he had dreamed about the project for years before he knew me. And then that's when our project started. So after 5 years, we now have our own 10 or 12 properties. A couple still need renovating, but we rent only to refugees, although his sister lives in one of the properties that his family owned. And so there's a white family with kids. I mean, she's divorced, so it's just a single mom. Most of our refugees happen to be from Afghanistan, but they also are from all over. Most are single moms. We eventually were able to buy, I was, with my financial help, an empty office building at the end of this single block. And we have ESL classes, arts and craft classes, after school homework for the refugee kids in the neighborhood, all of that. And so it's become an amazing project, exemplary for the city of Albany, has been in the newspaper 4 or 5 times or more. And Tim has been recognized very much as a leader in the refugee, we call it the RWC, Refugee Welcome Center and Refugee Welcome Project.
So you have a lot of social justice characteristics in you.
Yes.
Kind of carried through your entire life. I mean, you know, given the times that we're in now, where social justice is kind of at the top of everyone's agenda, I mean, what do you see, what would you like to see happening over the next, 10 years or so, 5 to 10 years?
Wow, that's a question I didn't expect. Of course, I still love the term Black Lives Matter, because they do. That is the best 3 words I can think of for that movement that's been rejuvenated with these god-awful deaths in Minneapolis, in Atlanta, all over the place. Old ones, new ones, recent ones. Oh my goodness. And today's paper, I get the New York Times now, and it had one whole section with only photographs of, so probably 8 pages of photographs of all of the movements in cities all over the country, and a map of the US, including red dotting where all of these movements are happening. Thank goodness. We needed a renewal of the, I mean, I hate to say anti-slavery, but it is not a just country. We're embarrassed by our president. It's embarrassing to be in a country that still can treat Black people differently than white people when they're watching birds in the local park, or when they're, you know, standing in front of Wendy's, or whenever they're being accused of a crime and having a policeman put their knee on their neck. So yeah, I agree with this. And I've noticed that a lot of universities have already made new commitments to increasing their enrollment of minorities. So that's an interesting move that's happening. And, you know, job market needs to change, and salaries need to change. I mean, I, of course, had to fight that my whole career as a woman who was paid way less than I would have been paid had I been male with the same exact background. And I had to join class action here at University of Arizona when they were trying to equalize the women's salaries to men's. So I've been there, done that as a woman. But now when you think as the Black people or the Hispanic people, it needs to be done as well.
Have you seen, you have 2 daughters who are doctors, right? So have you
Yes.
seen the whole salary kind of thing changed in terms of equality for men and women through them?
I think it is improving, but I don't think it's there yet. And medicine is maybe ahead of some of the other areas, because certainly women's salaries are not the same as men's when they have the same education, same job, and same, you look at them and they're still, you know, anywhere from 25 to 30% lower, I think. Maybe it's gotten to 15% in some jobs, but salaries are still lower for women, and that needs to become equal.
So what do you know, I see you as probably keeping on with fighting, you know, for many more years. I mean, what, you know, when your fight's finally over, what do you think, I mean, what do you want to see, and what would you say to those who are still continuing the fight?
Well, a lot of the education, I'm an educator. I always have said I'm first an educator and then a doctor. And so I still see that more as a part of who I am than what I actually do, like harvesting fruit. I still think my role as an educator is important. And I do still do an occasional semester lecture to the pre-med students at the U of A here. But I think that, for example, one of my very close friends in the Albany area had a grandchild come out as trans and born as female and now is identifying as male. So I was talking to this woman extensively on the phone. And for example, a lot of people really don't know that your gender identity and your sexual orientation are 2 very different traits. And that's important to be able to teach people. And so a lot of people can't understand why somebody, I had transgender patients way back when, why somebody would transgender from female to male and then be a gay man. You know, well, wait. If you were born female and you like men, why the heck did you change? Because my identity is male. My sexual orientation is gay male. And those are 2 different traits that we're born with. It's not a choice. It's things that we're born with. And that's very important to people to realize that it's not a choice. Nobody would choose that. in this day and age because of and in other countries, my goodness, if you're in Nigeria, can be killed for being a gay man, and you're certainly incarcerated. And that's true in many countries. And so nobody would choose that. It's who you understand yourself to be, how God created you. We have a service in Tucson every year for Pride Week. And I was on the planning committee a couple of times for that Pride service. And the Pride Committee gave the call to worship, and it truly was multi-faith. It wasn't just different Christians. It was Christian, Jewish, Islam, Hindu, some of the Native American, Buddhist, on and on and on. And so because I work with so much Muslim population in Albany and some here as well, have done a lot of reading on Islam and on Muhammad, and I had known nothing, and I really needed to read several books on that. So I agreed to find something in the Quran that would be welcoming to the gay lesbian community. And that was hard to do, but I finally found something. And then when I went to the Pride service, there I was sitting next to the Imam, who was also a part of the service. And before the service, I sort of bumped his elbow and said, "Oh, this is the section I chose from the Quran that I thought was inclusive of God welcoming you as to who you were born to be." And he looked at it, he said, "That's the exact choice I would have made." And I was so honored. I was so honored.
Okay, do you have any other stories that you'd like to tell us?
I do have some stories. Let me tell you one, and this is just for one of my favorites regarding caring for the elderly population. Our population in our country is getting old, and the age, luckily for those of us who are also older, the life expectancy continues to increase. So that means as doctors, you have more and more older patients. Well, this is something I read in one of my family practice journals, but I love this story, and it changed myself as a doctor even. A lady in her young 80s, like 82, 83, fell and broke her hip. She immediately called 911 because she couldn't get up and got taken to the hospital, was seen in the ER, and then admitted and was scheduled for hip repair surgery that afternoon. Her daughter, who was in her 50s, was a doctor at that hospital. And so as things go in this kind of a community, this was not in Tucson, the doctor heard that her mom was admitted, so quickly finished her rounds to try and go and see her mom and commiserate with her and try and reassure her about this coming surgery. But as many of us docs would do, even though it might not be quite legal, she went online and reviewed her mom's chart first. And the chart said, rule out Alzheimer's. And she said, "My mom does not have Alzheimer's. What is this about?" She read a little further and she said, "Oh, I think I get it." So she went to see her mom and commiserated with her about the fall, but said, "Mom, you've been in good health. I'm sure you'll come through the surgery fine." She said, "But Mom, we have to make sure that Grandma comes to visit you tomorrow." And her mom said, "But honey, she's so frail. She doesn't get out of the house hardly at all anymore." Well, this lady who was 82 or 3 was caring for her 101-year-old mother at home. And when she got to the ER, she was ranting and raving about who would take care of her mom. And of course, they all thought she was crazier than crazy. And so, in fact, they did bring the grandma in the next day, had her visit the docs and nurses in the ER to show them that, in fact, this 80-year-old lady was still a primary caregiver for her 101-year-old mom. And so I love that story, a true story, obviously. And it taught me to not assume, if I had patients in their 70s or even 80s, that their parents were dead. To say, are your parents alive? And some were, in fact, caring for their parents at home. And so it did teach me to do a better job of history taking, even me, who thought she was pretty good at it.
And you're still on your own. You walk every day. You you bake granola and cookies and all kinds of things. I mean,
Yes, I do.
it seems like you're just going to keep, go ahead.
Yep. I'm staying healthy. I walk at least 6 miles a day. But I'm looking at the clock, and I think I have time to tell you one more story. Can I tell you?
Please.
This is actually what I call a spiritual story. This is from working in the prison system. I liked working in the prison system, believe it or not. I was medical director of the prison system in Hawaii for 8 years. And then in New Mexico, where I moved from Hawaii before I came back to Tucson, for about a year and a half. And I have so many stories from working in the prison system. I always say I worked in a system I didn't believe in. Most of the people in our prison system belong in residential drug treatment, drug and alcohol treatment, not in prison. But they do deserve community standard health care, and that's the law. So in Hawaii, I was blessed because the standard of care was already pretty good when I joined the prison system. But I still had I had to get a hepatitis C treatment program. So I'm also an expert in hepatitis C, and that became my national education role when I was medical director of Hawaii's prison system. But here's my favorite story one of my favorites from Hawaii's prison. I was seeing a man in his 60s one time, a patient I had cared for because I took care of patients as well as was administrative. And I was saying, he was Hawaiian. And I was saying to him, his name was also Michael. Michael, congratulations. It's now 4 years since we diagnosed your kidney cancer and your kidney surgery, and there's no sign of recurrence of your kidney cancer. And he said, Doc, do you have time for a story? And I said, sure. I knew Michael to be a beloved inmate in that he worked on a work line that was in the chapel, that we actually had some paid workers that were called the chapel work line, which meant he was a bit of a counselor to others who needed it and so forth. And we tried to practice what we call crime blind in Hawaii because we didn't want to have prejudice against our inmate patients. But I sort of knew that he was in prison for like a white collar, crime, which was very unusual for Hawaiian patients, but something to do with business and stealing money from a business or something like that, but I didn't know much about it. So none of that fit very well. But anyway, I said, sure, tell me. So he said, well, Doc, it was here at the men's prison, I had to go to the hospital the night before my kidney surgery, and I was in the orange scrub suits or suits that the inmates wear when they are taken off campus. And they're in the back of the van, and they have their hands shackled to each other and shackled to their waist, and their ankles are shackled. So he's in the back of the van, and he's on his way to the hospital. Well, the driver of the van is taking him, has no idea what he's taking him to the hospital for. Medical information is very private in the prison system. But he sees that Michael is fidgety and nervous, and that's just not his nature. And so he's wiggling and squirming, and when they stop at the hospital and he takes him to admission, he says, Michael, why are you so nervous? He said, well, I have kidney cancer. I'm having surgery in the morning. I'm scared to the death. And the guard, the corrections officer, lifts up his shirt, has a nephrectomy scar around his side. He said, I donated my kidney to my mother. You'll be all right. Michael thought, oh my God, who'd have thought that one of the guards here had been a kidney donor? So he calmed down, was doing better, was admitted to the hospital. And then a guard is sitting next to his bed because all the inmates in the hospital are chained to their bed, so they can't get up and, pace if they're nervous or whatever. And there's a guard next to him 24/7. So by evening, Michael's getting nervous again, and he can't sleep, and he's wiggling in his bed and so forth. And this guard, a different one, says the same thing, Michael, because he doesn't know why he's sitting next to this inmate, but he knows him. He knows that he's on is a on the chapel work line and is not normally nervous and fidgety and everything. He said, Michael, why are you so nervous? He says, well, I've got cancer. I have kidney cancer, and I'm going to have my kidney removed in the morning, and I'm scared to death. Well, this corrections officer lifted up his shirt, had a nephrectomy or kidney scar, and said, I donated my kidney to my sister. You'll be all right. And Michael found the Lord, and that he knew then he'd be all right. And that was his trip into becoming a Christian, and I would just say more living a good life, and knowing that those were gifts to him of not, who would have thought that 2 corrections officers had donated their kidneys. Later on, there is a little postscript to this that there's a couple of them, and maybe I can take the time to tell you.
Yeah, plenty of time.
Michael,
Yeah.
okay, we had an inmate admitted to our men's prison who was being worked up to be a kidney donor to his brother. And I had to decide as medical director whether we would continue this workup or not. And I thought, oh my goodness, yes, inmates have nothing but bad reputations. Let's do something good for the community. So we had him worked up, and he was a match. So he was able to donate, and the recipient's insurance pays for it. So the correction system didn't have to pay for the surgery. So anyway, he donated his kidney to his brother. The surgery went well. His brother did fine after the surgery. The head of public safety and the warden agreed. Normally, 2 people wouldn't be able to see each other. We restrict visitors in the hospital very much because it's a good time to pass drugs. And so, but they allowed the 2 brothers to see each other after the surgery, which was amazing. And the brother was a cop. So the kidney donation went from an inmate to a police officer. And so they actually let the newspaper know, and it became a newspaper article that the brothers were seeing each other, and one was an inmate and one was a cop. And so that was really amazing. It was amazing. So, and the only other PS to this, and then I'll be done, is that we had 2,000 male inmates at a facility up here in Eloy, run by a private one, because Hawaii, like many, many, many other states, incarcerated and yet wouldn't build prisons at the rate they were incarcerating, so had to put many on the mainland. And it was still my job as medical director to come regularly to supervise and make sure the medical care met the community standards. So I was up in Eloy and doing my quarterly visit, and I was looking for an inmate at the facility that we had asked for early release for because he was dying of liver disease, end-stage liver disease, which was becoming the most common cause of death. And we'd gotten permission from the system to get him early release. So I was looking for him. Well, he was dying of liver. He was not in the facility. They said, oh, he's at the ER at St. Mary's. So I came down to Tucson and went to the ER in St. Mary's and finally found him there. And he was there, and there were, 3 guards with him. And I gave him the news that we were going to bring him home on the next flight because he had gotten early release for medical reasons. Well, you can imagine his joy. You can just imagine. And then after I told him that, I walked out, and all the guards followed me out, and they said, Doc, this man has been telling us all day that a miracle was going to happen. He was in the ER to have his ascites tapped because people in liver failure just keep building up fluid and they eventually need it tapped. So that's why he was there. So the guard said, he's been telling us all day a miracle was going to happen. He said, they said, you're that miracle. I said, no, I'm not a miracle. I'm just doing my job. Let me tell you what I think is a miracle. And I told them Michael's story. And they all listened intently. And then at the end of that, one of the guards was a woman, she looked at me and she said, "Thank you so much, Doc. I'm a kidney cancer survivor." So, oh my goodness. And I had not told, Michael had given me permission to tell his story, but I had not told it out of Hawaii. And there I did. And it was just a gift to that one lady. So that's my spiritual stories of working in the prison system.
Well, just amazing, Kay. And you are a real gift, I think, to the human race. So
Thank you.
thank you so much for sitting down with me for a little while and telling your story. And look forward to many years of lots more stories from you.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah, people do encourage me to write a book. And, you know, I've got one in my head and actually started called Surviving Suicide. And I want us to do it as a family. So, but everyone says I should put all my doctor stories into a book. And I haven't started that one yet. But thank you.
Thank you, Kay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.